All right, we're going over the names and attributes of God, and we left off talking about uh, the name El Roi, which is the God who sees me. And we talked about some of the implications that come with that name. We know that Hagar is the one that attributed that name or pinned that name to God after she leaves her master Sarah, who is treating her poorly, and an angel of God comes to Hagar in the wilderness and intervenes, and Hagar recognizes God as the God who sees. So that's what the name El Roi means. We left off with some homework, looking at Psalm 139, which really talks about a God who sees and understands us. But there's many different things that come to mind when we start talking about God and his nature, his characteristics, and even his names. There was a philosopher at one point who was walking down the sea, and he comes across this little boy who's digging a hole in the sand. And as he's digging that hole in the sand, the theologian, he stops and ponders, what is this kid doing? And he goes up and he asks the kid, he's like, hey, what are you digging that hole for? And the kid says, I'm trying to fit the ocean in this hole. When we start talking about the attributes of God, we need to understand that we're trying to comprehend an infinite God, and we're trying to pack that into our finite minds. And there's going to be things that we don't completely understand about God and his nature and his characteristics. There's going to be things that go so far above our head that it's hard to just wrap our minds around what's being talked about, or even the thought and concept itself. So when we get into El Roi, the God who sees me, the God who understands, we're going to run into some places or some thoughts that may be difficult and maybe even impossible for our finite minds to completely comprehend. So Psalm 139 was the homework assignment, taking a look at that. Let's start off by reading, we'll split it up. Somebody wants to read the first 12 verses, and then somebody else 13 through 24. All right, so just a few questions on that. What dimensions of God's knowledge are described in this psalm? Seems to be no limit. Yeah, so ever present. What is the psalmist also asking for God? We see that on the surface layer, the psalmist David, he understands that God knows him to his deepest core. But what also is David asking of God? To search him even more than what he already knows. And how much does God know? Everything. Can you pray that prayer sincerely to God? God, I want you not just to know me for who I am, but I want you to search me. I want you to search my heart. And not just on the surface layer. I want you to go even deeper than what you already know, oh God, than what I know. Now, you're not asking something impossible, but God already knows what's in that heart. Yeah. Yeah. So search me, reveal my faults, reveal my wrongdoing, so that I can turn back to you and be led in the everlasting way. What other dimensions? We see that he's all about, we see that he's all knowing. What other dimensions are listed here in this psalm? Okay. The light and dark, the time frame doesn't matter. So we have time and space. We have past, present, and future brought about in this psalm. We have knowledge that is beyond measure. Yeah. So he sees even the unseeable. It goes to the future tense. So what attributes of the God who sees me comes to your mind from that psalm? So he's not limited to just those who follow him. He is limitless at that point. He is able to go beyond, above even man's power. Even if you try to block out God, even if you say there is no God, that doesn't stop God from knowing who you are. What else? There's one word that comes to my mind when I think of Psalm 139. Infinite. God is infinite. What do we mean when we say God is infinite? without bounds. Yeah, without bounds goes back to the point that Larry made, that limitless, there is no set limit on God. Yeah. So we have the quantitative measurement of infinite. There is no end. It's boundless. When we say God is infinite, it means that he is non-finite in his eternal being. So to be finite is to have limits, to be contained and structured around limitations. We as human beings are bound by different limitations. For instance, time. Time is something that we have limitations on. We know that there's 24 hours in a day. We know that there's 7 days a week. We know there's 365 days in a year. We are bound by that time frame. We know that we come to a beginning and we know that we come to an end. We are bound by that time frame. We are also bound by really somewhat this earthly flesh and the desires that come with it. However, God has provided a way of escape for that. But we, in and of ourselves, cannot achieve being free from that on our own, so we are limited in our capability in that sense. There's a limit to our knowledge. Only so much that we can know. Only so many degrees that we can obtain. We are limited in our power. There's always going to be somebody above us. We are limited in our presence. Can't be everywhere at once. And as we've talked about, we're limited in our existence. God has no such limit. He is unlimited. He is unbounded in every conceivable way. Now, that's hard for us to conceive of an infinite being. If we were not careful, we can end up having a faulty description or definition of the idea of God being infinite. Cottrell classifies what God's infinity is not, though. Cottrell says, this is not to be taken in a physical or mathematical sense as if God were infinitely large or as if he extends infinitely into space, nor does it refer to merely quantitative distinctions between God and his creation as if God and man have the same attributes, except God has them to the infinite degree. An example of this would be that God and man have the same kind of knowledge, only man's is limited while God's is unlimited. To an extent, this is true, but it is not the whole point or even the main point of infinity. To say that God is infinite means that he is not limited by anything outside himself. He is not subject to the built-in limitations of created beings. Finite beings, for instance, are by nature subject to certain restrictions of time and space The infinite God is not. God, in essence, as the creator of all things, is only limited by the things that he limits himself to. God says that he is love. That is a bound that he puts on himself. It goes to his nature, it goes to his essence, it goes to his characteristics. God puts into place time and space. God is not bound by that time and space. He's able to go above, beyond, extend out over that time and space, something that we as human beings cannot do. Yeah. I think that's hard for everybody to comprehend. With sin as rampant as it is in the world around us, how do we delegate God's holiness, his separateness, his freeness of sin? But there is what seems to be an apparent paradox in the statement, God being infinite, when related to his creation. Creation both demonstrates God's limitless and boundless power and limitations of God's power, but God gave to his creation an independence from himself in as much as he gave men and angels free will. God created us as human beings to have free will. Does that mean that God is limited in his power to control what mankind does? Well, no. And if God is without sin, does that mean that God is limited in that he cannot sin? Yes, because he put that limitation on himself. He's put the limitation on us, or rather, he's put a limitation in the idea of free will, meaning that we have free choice. We can do whatever we please. Is God still in control? Absolutely. But we as human beings still have free will to do as we please. An even harder concept to grasp and understand. We're digging in that sand trying to fill that hole with an ocean. But unlike other attributes of God, like holiness, love, being just and righteous, the attribute of God being infinite should be thought of as a qualifying attribute, since it qualifies all the other attributes. For example, God is holy, and his moral character is infinite in that it is not limited by any kind of moral defect, weakness, or sin. God is love, and his love is not bounded by selfishness. It's not bounded by ignorance, pride, arrogance. So in every way, God is infinite. His love is infinite. His holiness is infinite. But there's several ways in his character that show and demonstrate this idea. And these are fairly obvious ways and topics that many preachers talk about on occasion, such as God's omnipotence, God's omnipresence, God's omniscience. All of those speak to an infinite God. So he is omnipotent, meaning that he is all powerful. We also see this in his existence. He is self-existent. We see this with regards to time and space, his omnipresence, or in other words, his eternal nature. And we also see this with regard to his knowledge, his omniscience. So, firstly, we have unlimited or infinite existence. Look over in Exodus, the 3rd chapter. Exodus chapter 3. And if somebody would read verse 14 for us. Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14. All right, so Moses is trying to figure out from God after he's appeared to him in this burning bush, who do I tell the people that you are? Who do I tell these Israelites who has sent me? Who do I tell Pharaoh who has sent me? And God says, I am who I am. Now, that's another name that we'll talk about in more detail later on. But what is implied from the idea of God revealing himself as I am? The idea of limitless or infinite or unlimited existence. Somebody says, I am sent you. What does that mean to you? What does it mean to us? It's the same one. Jesus had made a couple of statements referring to who he was. On occasion, he made the statement, I am. What did that mean to the Jews? Deliverance. Mm-hmm. The Jews recognized I am as God. And in the statement, I am, leaves out any room for anything else. I am what? When we say I am in a normal everyday conversation, it's normally followed by I am Hunter, I am a Christian, I am going to the store, there's something that follows. The statement here is left blank and open. I am speaks to God being infinite. Look over in John chapter 5, verse 26. John 5 and verse 26. We're going to look at 3 different passages here. And I want you to think about God's self-existence in these 3 passages. So John chapter 5 and verse 26, if somebody wants to read that for us. Now think for a minute about God's self-existence in that verse. Hold on to that thought. Let's go over to Romans chapter 1 and verse 23. Romans chapter 1 and verse 23. Romans, the first chapter, verse 23, if somebody wants to read that for us. Again, think about God's self-existence in this passage. What message do we get from this passage about the idea of God's self-existence? And then hold on to that thought in your head. In 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 16. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 16. How do those passages convey the idea of God's self-existence? Okay. What words stood out to you when thinking about God's self-existence in those verses? Immortality. Life in himself. That's one that always stands out to me when I read John. Life in himself. Good use of the Greek word there. Never wears out. Never tires down. Speaks to God being the same as he was. He's going to be the same as he always is. Always will be. His ear does not become dull. His eyes do not become blind. He's not bound in the essence of having been created. Another concept difficult for us in finite minds to be able to comprehend. no variableness. Mhm. His word is um, always going to stay true. There's no error. It's inerrant in and of itself. Let's look at a couple other passages. Acts 17, verses 24 through 25. Acts 17, verses 24 through 25. Now, this time I want you to think about God being self-sufficient. God's self-sufficiency in these verses. Acts chapter 17, verses 24 through 25. If somebody wants to read that for us. So think about God being self-sufficient. Think about some of the words that are used in the idea of God being self-sufficient. And then hold on to that thought. And let's go over to Romans chapter 11. Romans chapter 11, verses 34 and 35. If somebody wants to read that for us. Think about God being self-sufficient in these verses. What words stand out? What thought stands out? And then we'll look at one more. Job chapter 41, verse 11. Job 41:11. Job 41:11. And then if you want to write that one down, Isaiah 43, verses 12 through 13. So how do those passages convey the idea of God's self-sufficiency? He is self-sufficient in the fact that he doesn't need anything. Mhm. He is the source of everything. You also think, when we think about pagans and their worship of different gods, they used to think that they made sacrifices to those gods in order for those gods to eat. They didn't offer sacrifices, their gods were not going to eat. Is that a self-sufficient God? That is a God who relies on a people for self-sustenance. Yes. The one who created those gods. A lot of the pagan worshipers, that's why they would sacrifice, and even to, at some extent, they would sacrifice their children in times of famine because they knew that their gods needed to eat. Our God, just like Paul says there in Acts, he does not need our hands for worship. He is self-sufficient. He created us. He understands us. He knows us. He does not need us, though, in order to be sufficient. What else? How do those other passages convey the idea of God's sufficiency? I think Paul summed it up perfectly there in Acts, speaking of God's sufficiency. The fact that we have a creator who is in no need of anything else speaks to God being infinite in his existence. He's not limited in the fact that he needs people to worship him. He's not limited in the fact that he needs people to offer sacrifices in order to feed him. He's not limited in the fact that he needed somebody to create him. He is the I am. Just by the power of his breath and by the power of his speech, he speaks things into existence. Just from the mere utterance of his own words, things fall into place like time and space, the things that we barely comprehend today. The complexities of the mind and all of its facets, not even the most sophisticated and well-devoted brain surgeon is able to comprehend all of the facets of the brain and the mind. Not even the most scholarly is able to understand the existence to its fullest extent of our God. That's what God means when he says, I am. And that is the God who sees. That in and of itself is powerful. You mean to tell me that there is a God out there who is all powerful, all knowing, all sufficient, one who is always present, who is capable of seeing me even in my weakest moments? Yes. That is why we worship the El Roi, the God who sees. Questions, comments, concerns? I mean, there's more material that we could go over thinking about the infinite God who sees us. Anybody want the final word, though?